Welcome to our second session of Jewish Ethics for a Meaningful Life with Rabbi Elliot Dorff. Today's topic will be aid in dying. This is a topic that Rabbi Elliot Dorff has wrote extensively on and done extensive research. So we're very, very excited to have him speak on this today. And just a little bit about Rabbi Dr. Elliot Dorff. He is the past president of the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies. He is a prominent interfaith leader in the Jewish community and is a distinguished professor here at American Jewish University in philosophy, and has actually been with us directing the rabbinical and master's program since 1971. I could go through his entire Rolodex and his very large and impressive background, but I will let his words speak for himself. And we're so excited to be here with you today to present this lecture on your new book. And without further ado, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, please take it away.
Hello there. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. Today, I'm going to be talking about aid in dying as one example of how we can apply the Jewish tradition to modern ethical issues. But before I do that, I want to do some preliminary work on methodology. Specifically, how do you take an ancient tradition and apply it to modern circumstances, some of which our ancestors could never have even imagined, let alone dealt with? And even if they did deal with them, then how do you apply what they said to what we said, to our current circumstances? So I'm going to be talking about those kinds of methodological issues first, and then you'll see how that then leads to the question of aid in dying, how it affects what I think about aid in dying. So first thing then on a methodological level is how do we learn to be moral in the first place? How do we, assuming that we want to be moral, and that we want to be moral for any one of a number of reasons, how do we learn how to be moral? Well, part of that is just simply what our parents teach us, and then what we learn in kindergarten. There's that wonderful book, All I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And in that book, I think there are 250 some things that the author, I forgot his name, learned in kindergarten. And then later on in the interactions that you have with your peers and with your teachers and with camp counselors and the like. And then, once you become an adult, moral learning doesn't end, because even though some of the basics are pretty set in your life by that time, there are always issues like aid in dying that you maybe have not confronted in the past, and that you have to understand from the roots that you have in moral thought. You have to learn how to apply that to the new circumstance. And by the way, new circumstances are not just matters of technology, new medical breakthroughs, breakthroughs in business. I mean, nobody ever imagined about doing business on the internet, because the internet didn't exist. So how do you gain moral guidance about doing business on the internet, and all of the various issues that the internet poses in terms of language issues, which we're going to talk about next time. But one of the things that we Jews want from our tradition is moral guidance. We very much honor the tradition for a whole series of other reasons. It may be our family history, it's our community. It gives us a sense of moral guidance. It gives us a sense of rootedness and of mission in the future and in the present. It gives us art, music, dance. It gives us literature, philosophy. It gives us all kinds of things that we prize as Jews, and that link us into the Jewish tradition. But one of the things that we would hope for from the Jewish tradition is moral guidance. And how do we get moral guidance from the Jewish tradition? Through a number of ways. And those are the ways that I talk about in chapter 4 of the book that I'm using for this series, Ethics at the Center of Jewish Theory and Practice for Living a Moral Life. One of them is moral precepts. There are a number of, starting with the book of Proverbs, you get a whole book about how one should live one's life. Later on, Maimonides in his Code of Ethics, his Code of Law, in the second book of that, Hilchot Deot, laws of characteristics, of moral characteristics. He gives his understanding of how a Jew should live. Later on, you get others in the Musar movement, for example, in the 19th century, you get other Jewish expressions of how one should live one's life. So moral precepts begin with that. And of course, that doesn't start with the latter books of the Bible. It starts with the Torah itself, that gives us a lot of directions as to how we're supposed to live our lives. Leviticus chapter 19 is full of those kinds of moral precepts. You're not supposed to take revenge or bear a grudge. You're supposed to have honest weights and measures. You're supposed to honor your parents. You're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. All of this is in Leviticus chapter 19. So one of the ways in which the Jewish tradition gives us moral guidance is through moral precepts. Another is through the stories of the tradition. The book of Genesis, for example, is filled with dysfunctional families. So you can learn from those stories how not to treat your wife or your husband, how not to treat your children. Don't prefer any one of them over the others. You learn also questions about resolving disputes among family members. You have a lot of examples of that done well and that done poorly in the stories of Genesis and in the later stories of the Bible. Morals, morals and stories. And by the way, later on in rabbinic stories and Hasidic stories and in modern contemporary stories, we get a lot of moral guidance as to what works in life and what does not as a way of living morally. Then another way of doing it is through moral leaders. Sometimes we have people in our lives who really are models for us as to how to live, people who lived life well. That might be our parents, that might be some of our teachers in the past, that might be some of our friends, or even some of the people that we model ourselves after in our general community. So that's another way in which we model ourselves. When John F. Kennedy was president, he wrote this book, Models of Courage, and talking about some of the people that he really tried to emulate. Another way in which we learn how to be moral is through prayer, and for Jews that may not be obvious, but evangelical Christians very often talk about having a moral problem and that they will pray on it. Not that just they'll think about it, but they'll pray on it. And what they have in mind is that they will think about this moral issue in the larger context of their beliefs and of their convictions. And I think prayer can work for Jews that way as well. Certainly, if you pray morning, afternoon, and evening, or even pray just on Shabbat, one of the things that the liturgy is trying to get you to do is to look at life from a much broader perspective, from a transcendent perspective, actually, from the viewpoint of God, to the extent that we can know that. And the idea is then once you see your moral problem in that larger context, it may take on a very different set of meanings, and it also may give you direction as to which of various possibilities would be the best one. Another aspect of the Jewish tradition that helps us understand morality is study. Talmud Torah is a very important part of the Jewish tradition, and in the Jewish tradition, it's not a pediatric religion. It's not for children alone. It's definitely for adults, and in Judaism, study is lifelong. So I am 81 years old. I'm a rabbi. I'm still studying, still learning things that I never knew before, and that's one of the real riches of our tradition. It brings with it a tremendous treasure trove of wisdom and of knowledge and of just the fun of arguing with one another and all of that, right? I mean, and reading the texts. Starting with the Torah itself, but the Talmud certainly is one page of arguments after another, to hone our sense of judgment as to what to do and what not to do. So study and simply study, and the traditional way of study is not on your own. The traditional way of study is study in chevruta with a friend, and so then that kind of back and forth is also one of the ways in which we learn the morals of study itself, of honesty and perseverance and listening to the other person before you jump in to talk about your own idea, and to be able to balance positions back and forth. That's very much a function, that very much enables us to learn how to be moral in a variety of different ways. Law is probably the primary way in which the Jewish tradition tries to teach us how to be moral, because Jewish law deals with very concrete issues, and it shows us not only what we're required to do, but also what we should aspire to do, even if it's not required. And it also teaches us the limits of our obligations. In that way, law is better than moral principles to teach us how to live, because principles are infinite. But law enables us to know exactly what is required and also what is not required, the limits of what's required. So, for example, charity. The word charity comes from the Latin word caritas, which means caring. So, charity gives you a sense that you are a really wonderful person if you give charity. Whereas the Hebrew word is tzedakah, coming from the Hebrew word tzedek, meaning justice. So you're only doing what is justly required of you if you give what we call charity in English. But then the question is, well, how much? How much should you give in order to fulfill this obligation? And is there a limit to that? And the rabbis actually do say that there is a limit to that, namely 20% of your income. You're supposed to give 10% as a norm, but if you give more than 20%, you'd better be very wealthy, because the rabbis are worried that if you give more than 20% of your income, you yourself are going to need to have support, monetary support from other people. So one of the things that law does is that it enables us to tell us what our obligations are in very specific circumstances, and not just in general principles, and enables us to tell us what the limits of those obligations are. And then finally, theology. We are ultimately supposed to aspire to be godlike. And aspiring to be godlike means that we have to go beyond what the law might require of us. The Hebrew expression in the Talmud is lifnim mishurat hadin, usually translated beyond the letter of the law, and we need to aspire to be godlike and not just do the minimum of what is morally required of us. As a matter of fact, the rabbis say that one of the two reasons why the Second Temple was destroyed was because Jews at the time did not go beyond the letter of the law and do what was required of them as a people, as a holy people. Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. Exodus 19:6. We are supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Well, that means that we need to aspire to do and to actually do beyond what the minimum of the law requires of us. So those are some of the ways in which the Jewish tradition helps us learn how to be moral and helps us motivate us to be moral. But another piece of this has to do with, well, what happens when you need to apply Jewish law to new circumstances that the law did not deal with in the past, or that the Jewish tradition itself did not deal with in the past. And as I said a moment ago, that's not only true for modern questions that are the result of new technologies, that, things like in medicine or in communications or in business or in a whole series of other areas, but even some of the moral obligations that have been around since the dawn of civilization are now sometimes in new contexts. So, for example, honor your father and mother. The way that was done, really until maybe 50, 60 years ago in the Jewish tradition, was that the way you were supposed to do that is that you were supposed to take care of your elderly parents in your own home. And by the way, when I was growing up, I thought honor your father and mother meant I had to obey my parents. And my parents did not disabuse me of that interpretation. It was only when I was in rabbinical school that I found out that the Talmud understands honor your father and mother to apply to middle-aged people taking care of elderly parents. And what it says is that honor your father and mother means that you have to feed them when they cannot eat themselves. You have to help them go in and out when they cannot walk by themselves. And it certainly meant until very recently in Jewish history that you would take care of them at your own home when they could not function on their own. But that was when Jews, like most other communities, lived in extended families. So you lived at least in the same block or the same neighborhood, and often in the same building as your aunts, uncles, cousins, children, grandchildren, and the like. And so there was always at least some people home to be able to take care of mom and dad when they got old. But now we live in nuclear families where even the children very often are thousands of miles away, let alone the grandchildren. And so then the question becomes, well, and nobody's home because women are working outside the home as well as men, mostly in our society anyway. So nobody's home to take care of mom and dad when they get old and cannot take care of themselves. So is an assisted living facility a fulfillment of that obligation? Or a skilled nursing facility ultimately? Or is there some other way in which one is supposed to try to take care of one's parents given modern social circumstances? So the new circumstances are not always just simply a function of modern technology or medical breakthroughs. They also are because of the circumstances in which we live. So let's take, since we're talking about end of life issues today, let's take removing life support from mom, let's say. Right? Mom is on life support, and that means that can mean a heart-lung machine. Um, that can mean artificial nutrition and hydration. That is, mom is being fed and given liquids by tubes of various sorts because she can no longer eat on her own. Um, so, if when, if any, at any time, should you remove life support from mom? Now, that kind of life support that I just talked about didn't exist until 50, 60 years ago. And some of it is still now coming into existence. So our ancestors really never talked about that. I mean, our ancestors were really very good on the psychosocial parts of the end of life because when you were very sick, you were very sick at home, and you were among those people who knew you and who loved you. And so the psychosocial pieces of end of life care were being done by people who knew and loved you in an environment that you knew and were familiar with. Now, because of our current living contexts, when somebody gets very sick, there could be caregivers that come from outside and are in the home with the person, but people that the person has not known beforehand, or it could be in an assisted living facility, or ultimately in a skilled nursing facility, or a hospice ultimately, right? So the question is, well, what is there any time when the life support should be removed, may be removed from mom, or maybe even should be removed from mom? Now that question never existed in classical literature. The most we have like 3 or 4 sources that I've been able to identify in Talmudic literature and thereafter that even imagine that we human beings have some ability to extend somebody's life when that person is in the process of actively dying. Because again, until very recently in human history, preventive medicine was pretty good. That is, our ancestors, including Jews, knew pretty much about what you should do in order to take care of yourself. They knew, for example, that you should eat fruits and vegetables, not too much meat. They knew that you had to get roughly 8 hours of sleep a night. And by the way, we Americans are the most sleep-deprived society in the world, and we pay a lot for that in terms of our health, cortisol levels, and all kinds of other things. and they knew also that one should get some exercise. So all of those preventive kinds of healthcare, the rabbis knew quite well. And as a matter of fact, already in the Torah, you get quarantine. This is Leviticus 12 and 13, where, in the case of tzara'at, they usually translated leprosy, but whatever it was, the Torah itself understands that when you have a communicable disease, part of the way that you prevent the spread of it, is that you quarantine people. And in 1955, I got measles. This was before the measles vaccine, and the Milwaukee County Health Department came and quarantined our house. So only my parents could come in and out, and my sister and I were stuck there for a month. And that was, so quarantine was alive and well in the 1950s with communicable diseases, but it was already in the Torah. So the preventive kinds of healthcare were pretty good. The curative kinds of healthcare were terrible. The only kinds of things they could do until, again, roughly the 20th century, was either bloodletting. They figured out a long time ago that a lot of diseases were carried by blood, but they thought that the way that you would deal with that is by taking a pint of blood. That unfortunately does not work for curing the vast majority of diseases. It does work for one disease that my mother had, polycythemia. The blood was too thick, too many red blood corpuscles, and so the medical way of dealing with that still to this day is to take a pint of blood every once in a while. But that's the only disease for which it works. And the other thing they could do aside from taking a pint of blood is a surgery. But if they did surgery, you were very likely to die as a result of loss of blood or of infections. Some of you may remember the movie Dances with Wolves. That it was it got the Academy Award for the best movie in 1990. Kevin Costner is the main character. This happens during the Civil War. He has a leg injury. He's taken to sick bay, and they showed at the very beginning of the movie what they did then. At the Civil War, they got the patient drunk. That was anesthesia, and then they got a number of people to hold them down, and they saw it. And if the person didn't die of loss of blood, the person would die of infections. And Kevin Costner sees this. The character that Kevin Costner plays sees this and runs away, and then the rest of the movie happens. But that's more or less historically accurate. That there was really no other. We didn't get sulfa drugs until the early 1900s, and antibiotics until around 1938, when it was first discovered. So I mean, and just to give you a sense of that, life expectancy in 1900 in this country was the mid-40s. Life expectancy in 2000, just 100 years later, was the mid-70s. So the advances in medicine have been absolutely amazing over the last century or so. But that then means that there's nothing in our tradition that says, may you remove life support, because there wasn't life support. So how do you deal with that? So some would say, well, if there are no sources, there's no guidance. In other words, if the Jewish tradition doesn't tell me about life support, then it's not going to give me any guidance whatsoever as to whether I may remove life support from mom now. The advantage of that way of looking at it is that it's honest. It's not pretending that the Jewish tradition is telling us anything that it's not telling us. The disadvantage is, well, where are you going to get guidance? Because no other tradition knew about life support either until it was invented in the 1960s and 70s, right? So where are you going to get guidance from? And if you're not going to get it from the Jewish tradition. And the other problem with this is that, as I mentioned earlier, we Jews really value the tradition in part because of the moral guidance it gives us. But if it's not going to be able to give us moral guidance in some very important parts of our lives, that detaches us from the tradition. It doesn't mean that we stop being Jewish, but it takes away one of the things that we value in being Jewish, namely the ability of the tradition to give us moral guidance. So the other end of the spectrum is that turn it over and turn it over again because everything is in it. This has been Bogbog and in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers. And if used in contemporary times, you would basically say, by hook or by crook, I'm going to find something in the tradition that will tell me whether I may remove life support from mom. Now, again, the advantage of that position is that then, assuming you find something, then you're at least in theory gaining moral guidance from the tradition, and the tradition is serving us in that way. The problem with that is that it's dishonest, because just take my word from it for it that the Jewish tradition never talks about heart lung machines or kidney dialysis until those things were invented. So if you're finding moral guidance from the tradition directly about those issues, you're not being honest. And the other problem with this is that if you're finding moral guidance about these issues in the tradition, you're really doing eisegesis rather than exegesis. You're reading into the tradition whatever it is you want to read into the tradition, and you're not getting tradition from the tradition, exegesis. You're not getting it from the tradition. So the tradition is really not guiding you morally. What it's doing is providing the source of authority that you claim is what's giving you guidance, when in fact it's not. You're just reading into it whatever you want. So a third way of dealing with this is personal autonomy. The tradition tells me nothing, and in any case, I have to take responsibility for my own decisions. And so if I'm going to remove life support from mom, then I just have to take responsibility for it. I may consult with rabbis, I may consult with doctors, consult with other family members, with whomever I want. But in the end, I'm the one that has to make the decision, and the Jewish tradition really has nothing to do with it. Now, again, the advantage here is that you're being honest about who's making the decision. The disadvantage is then we're all responsible for every decision we make without sharing that without being able to share that responsibility with our tradition or with anyone else. Again, you might consult all kinds of other people, but on this way of dealing with it, in the end, you are fully responsible for whatever the decision is. The advantage of this is that you are highlighting the fact that in the end, you do have to take responsibility for it. But the problem with it is that, especially for these life and death decisions, but even for other serious moral decisions in our lives, we would hope that we can share that responsibility with the wisdom of our own tradition, and with other people who have dealt with these kinds of issues before. So the problem with personal autonomy here is that often it's personal autonomy run amok. That is, it's so much autonomy that it is a real moral burden to decide on your own whether you're going to remove life support from mom. You have the full burden of that responsibility if you think that ultimately you're the one responsible, and you cannot share that responsibility with the tradition or anyone else. So what I would suggest, and what I suggest in the book, applying Jewish law wisely, which means that where Jewish law and the rest of the tradition, moral precepts and stories in our tradition and the like, where they give us moral guidance, by all means we should use them. We have to evaluate whether whatever was said in the past is still relevant today or is still wise today. So the fact that there is some precedent for it in the tradition doesn't mean that we should just accept it and be done with it. But we need at least to pay attention to whether there are precedents within our tradition for removing life support from mom, in my case, my example now, or for how you take care of mom and dad in order to honor them when they're old, right? So first you have to look at the sources in our tradition to see whether there are any things on point. And if there are not any things on point, then it seems to me that what you need to do is what I call depth theology. That is, you have to go to the underlying precepts and convictions of the Jewish tradition, the way in which the Jewish tradition understands ourselves, the concepts of the Jewish tradition, how the Jewish tradition understands who we are, who we ought to be, who we are as individuals, as members of a community, what we should aspire to be like, both as individuals and as a community. We need to do that kind of depth theology and then apply those principles and convictions and concepts to the case at hand. So that's what I would suggest as being the methodology that we should use in terms of mining the tradition for moral guidance. So let me stop here and take a few questions, if you have any, about this methodological issues, how you gain moral guidance, the various parts of our tradition that give us moral guidance, and then how to use Jewish law to give us moral guidance. Let me stop here and take a few questions about that, and then I'm going to move on to aid and dying. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand, and Alyssa's going to help us monitor that.
Yeah, so go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll go ahead and read them off. So first question is from Edna Stewart. She said, looking at life expectancy, how are we calculating? If you are looking at overall mortality rates, the 1900s, this is artificially, it is much lower life expectancy than today. So how do we calculate that?
How do we calculate what? The
How
life
do we calculate,
expectancy?
yeah, life expectancy?
I see. Well, one of them, life expectancy is usually calculated from the moment that a person is born. What are the probabilities that the person's going to live to what age, right? So it includes childhood diseases. First of all, it includes the problems of getting out of the womb to begin with, childhood death, which was much more common 100 years ago than it is now. As a matter of fact, a distant cousin of mine told me that my great grandfather had 3 wives because 2 of them died in childbirth. This was 100 years ago. And my mother um, um, gave birth to me, and then was pregnant with another child, which separated from the placenta separated from the uterus in the 6th month of pregnancy. But this is 1945 in Milwaukee. They did not know how to do safe C-sections at the time. There have been, it's called the cesarean section, because Julius Caesar was presumably birthed that way. But if you did a C-section until literally the 1950s, it meant that the woman would die. And the reason why you did it is because if you didn't do it, then both the woman and the fetus would die. So this was a way of trying to save at least one of them. But my mother was told to carry the child to term, and she delivered a stillborn, which in the meantime had poisoned her renal system, her kidneys, and she was bedridden for 2 years. And she was told by her doctors that she dare not get pregnant again because her kidneys could not withstand the pregnancy. So my sister was adopted. That was 1945 in this country, so not so long ago. So life expectancy includes the ability to be born in a healthy way, all of the childhood diseases, and remember, most of the vaccines are the 20th century and beyond. So I had measles in 1955. The measles vaccine was only in 1963. I had a friend who had polio. The polio vaccine was also the early 1960s. I had chickenpox a long time ago, and the chickenpox vaccine was only in 1993. So there are adults these days who have had chickenpox and were not vaccinated. So I mean, so life expectancy includes that, and then includes all of the diseases that come in as one is growing up, and the adulthood, and then ultimately the disease of old age. So when I say that life expectancy was around 45 in the year 1900, that includes the entire span of life. And the same sort of thing now when I say that life expectancy now in America is in the mid 70s, that includes from being born to now. Now, first of all, you have safe C-sections because doctors learned how to use antibiotics in C-sections in the late 50s, early 60s, right? So actually, sorry, late 40s, early 50s. So you're already beginning to get many more C-sections in the 1950s. And now far fewer women thankfully die in childbirth than died in the early part of the 20th century, because we now know how to use antibiotics in C-section. And then, of course, we have the opposite problem. Our C-sections being used too often. And that's a whole other story. And are we using antibiotics too much in food production? so that they don't, so ultimately they don't work for us. That's another problem that we've got now because of the new medical advances. Each of them come with, with side effects, including one of them being ultimately they don't work anymore. So we've got all of those sorts of issues, but that's how life expectancy is measured.
We've got one more question from Michael. What is a useful role for a rabbi in trying to mine the tradition for moral guidance?
So the role of a rabbi is that presumably that person is a rabbi because that person has gone to rabbinical school and learned a lot about the tradition. Now, exactly how much that person has learned about the tradition and what part of the tradition, remember the tradition is really rich, what part of that tradition the rabbi has really focused on in rabbinical school and thereafter varies a lot from one rabbi to another. And in any case, in Jewish law, as in American law, there you become a lawyer by being a kind of a jack of all trades, and then most lawyers then specialize in one area of American law. Same sort of thing in regard to Jewish law. Most rabbis will have a basic idea of the parameters of Jewish law, but some rabbis will specialize in certain areas of it. So I do a lot of bioethics, so I get a lot of questions about bioethics. I certainly know how to keep a kosher home and how to kosher a kitchen and things like that, including a professional kitchen. But I am not an expert in food production in America, and there are rabbis who know much more about that than I do. So if I have that kind of a question, I will. Well, it used to be I would write a letter to that rabbi, and that rabbi would write a letter back to me with the answer. That's the She'elot Utshuvot literature, questions and answers. It's called the responsive literature, response to questions. The Bar Ilan website has some 300,000 of these She'elot Utshuvot, these responsa on this website. And there are responsa that are being created in the conservative movement and in the reform movement. And for the conservative movement, just go to Rabbinical Assembly and look at Jewish law, the tab Jewish Law, and then Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and you'll see all of these questions and answers that have been decided by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. Because a rabbi may just call another rabbi who has expertise in the issue, but if a rabbi wants to get a sense of how the movement would understand this, then the rabbi might ask the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards or the responsive committee in the Reform movement what the committee would say, and then you can find all of the Tshuvot, the rabbinic rulings, since we went digital around 1980, you can find them all on that website. And in the Reform movement, there's CCAR.net, CCAR is Central Conference of American Rabbis, www.ccarnet.net, and then just find a responsa, and you'll see some of the responsa of the Reform Responsa Committee. And in the Orthodox world, they still go primarily by asking a particular rabbi. And the Rabbinical Council of America for a while had a committee, but that I think has disbanded. And in the Orthodox world, it's still primarily you go to whichever rabbi you respect in regard to Jewish law generally, or in regard to a specific aspect of Jewish law. All right, let me move now to aid and dying. Because until very recently in human history, when somebody was dying, there was literally nothing that medicine could do in order to reverse that. They could do psychosocial issues that were really very important. And as I said, very often in antiquity until modern times, people who were dying were given psychosocial support much more effectively than what happens now when we end up in a hospital room or in a hospice room or whatever. But the medical pieces of it were really very limited. But morphine has been around for a very long time to quell pain. And people did quell pain also with getting people drunk and things on that order. But there have been, so quelling pain has been available to varying degrees in different societies at different times. But that was about all they could do medically. But now we have all of these new medications and machines that can keep us alive much longer than we would otherwise have lived. And then the big question becomes, well, may you ever not intervene, or once you have intervened, may you withdraw what you have done. And that, because it is a new question, not surprisingly, you get a whole series of positions among rabbis. So let me start from the very most conservative, small c, end of the spectrum. So Rabbi J. David Blake, for example, who was a professor at Yeshiva University, basically says that you must do absolutely everything to keep a person alive, and you may never withdraw what you've done. So you must put tubes into the person in order to deliver artificial nutrition, hydration, medication, whatever. You must attach people to whatever machines are important in terms of of what people might need. You must do that until the person dies of natural causes. Not natural anymore, really natural as augmented by all of these interventions. Then moving further, a little bit further, I'll say from the right, further left a little bit, is Rabbi Moshe Tendler, who was a professor at Yeshiva University and also a biologist. And his position is that you don't have to you don't have to intubate, you don't have to put tubes into a person, and you don't have to give a person particular medications. But once you do that, then you may not withdraw them. Right? So, and that's the position that a lot of American Orthodox rabbis take. That you don't have to do absolutely everything. In the Haredi world, I think you do, right? But in the modern Orthodox world, I think they follow Rabbi Moshe Tendler largely in America, namely that you don't have to intervene medically, but once you do, you may not withdraw it. Moving a little bit further down the spectrum, Rabbi Emanuel Jakubowicz, who was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and was the first person to write a full book on Jewish medical ethics. This was in 1959. And then he wrote a revised version in 1975. His position is that you do not have to intervene, but if you do intervene, and it turns out that the intervention is not to the medical benefit of the patient, then you may withdraw. And I heard him give a talk at Cedar Sinai here to a group of physicians. This is 1982 or something like that. In which he said to the physicians, if you have put somebody on a heart-lung machine and it is not helping to sustain the person, or that the person is never going to be able to live outside of without the support of the heart-lung machine, and maybe artificial nutrition and hydration as well, you may remove those interventions. But if you don't want to take the moral responsibility of doing that, he said to these doctors, put the, let's say, heart-lung machine on a timer for, let's say, 24 hours. 23 hours later, come back and re-examine the patient. And again, if it's not really doing anything beneficial for the patient, then you may turn off the machine. But if you don't want to do that, just walk out of the room and let the timer turn off the machine. So that's what happens in Shari Tzedek Hospital in Israel and a number of other Orthodox settings in Israel. They follow Rabbi Jakubowicz, which is you don't have to intervene medically if you don't think it's going to be for the benefit of the patient. And once you have intervened, you may withdraw if it's not going to be to the benefit of the patient to continue the intervention. But if you don't want to do that, then put it on a timer. And so the Orthodox hospitals in Israel use timers for that. In the conservative movement, in 1990, there were two rabbinic rulings of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, one by Rabbi Avram Reisner and one by me. We agree on about 85% of the issues. The primary thing in which we disagree is the status of artificial nutrition and hydration. Both of us would say you may both withhold interventions if you don't think it's going to be to the benefit of the patient, and you may withdraw them if you've tried them and they're not working to the benefit of the patient. Both of us would say that that's true for both medications and machines. Where we disagree is in regard to artificial nutrition and hydration. Rabbi Reisner would say, you always have to intubate. You have to put tubes into the person to deliver our nutrients and liquids if the person cannot imbibe them on his or her own. And Rabbi Reisner would say you always have to intubate, and you may never extubate. You may never take them out until the person dies of other causes. Because artificial nutrition and hydration is serving the function of food and liquids, and we all need food and liquids throughout our lives, and therefore you may not withhold them or withdraw them. I understand artificial nutrition and hydration as medicine, and therefore it may be withheld and withdrawn. The reason why I understand it as medicine is because it doesn't come into the body the same way that food and liquids normally does, namely through the mouth, and you taste it and you swallow it, and then it gets digested through your intestines and your stomach. It comes in through tubes, and the way that doctors do this is through the least invasive way possible. So first, it's a nasogastric tube through your nose and down your throat. Um, and they will do that to the extent that it works. But the problem is that even if you're unconscious, you have a coughing mechanism in your throat. So patients who have this in their throat try to take it out. And I've seen this happen in hospitals. And so often people on nasogastric tubes, even who are unconscious, have to have their hands tied to the bed so that they don't rip out the tube. So there's a point at which this is just no longer working. And so then the next thing will be intravenous feeding. They will try putting artificial nutrition hydration into your veins, starting first in your arms, and then when that no longer works, in your legs, and then sometimes in your shoulders. But the problem is that your veins were never really intended to have this kind of what doctors call insult. That is this kind of poking into the vein. And so very often the veins will leak at a certain point. Sometimes the veins will completely collapse if you do this, because veins were intended to take food and liquids that have been digested through your digestive system and then to carry them through the various parts of the body that need them, but not to have this inserted into a particular vein. So when intravenous feeding is no longer possible, you get blotches and all of that, then they will do a GI tube, a gastrointestinal tube, which is open surgery into your intestines. That's an open wound, and it carries with it all of the questions of keeping that clean and not having it infected and all of that. So I would say that because all of those procedures involve certain risk, and because this is not food and liquids in the same way that we normally think of food and liquids, because this doesn't have differences in taste or temperature or texture. None of that happens with these interventions. That therefore we should see this as medicine, and therefore as medicine it may be done if it's to the best interest of the patient, but it also may be withheld or withdrawn. And so in the Terry Schiavo case, for example, she was on artificial nutrition and hydration for 14 years. I would have said that it should have been withdrawn when it became clear that she was never going to come out of the coma, usually within the first year or so. Whereas Rabbi Reisner would said that it should never have been withheld or withdrawn, which it ultimately was after 14 years, and then she died. So that's where we differ. This then led to the question of aid in dying. It was called assisted suicide, and I wrote a rabbinic ruling for the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards in 1997 on aid in dying. And I said that even though I would say that one may withhold or withdraw interventions, even artificial nutrition and hydration, one should not assist a suicide. That's the language that I was using at the time, primarily because all of the reasons to assist a suicide are very problematic. If the person is depressed, well, if you're very sick, it's very clear that you might be depressed. But that's not a reason to assist a suicide. That's a reason to deal with the depression. medically in terms of whatever medicines can help you with depression, but also socially. I remember I was on a project on assisted suicide, a book project in 1990, I think it was. This was before the drugs for treating AIDS patients had been discovered, and the people who were putting this project together were able to get all of the authors together to plan the project. And one of the people we interviewed was a 36-year-old man who had AIDS. And he had seen how his friends who had AIDS had died, and he didn't want to die that way. So he had bought himself a 22 caliber pistol, and he had thought he had loaded it and pulled the trigger, and it didn't go off. And at that moment, a friend of his came by and saw what he had planned on doing. And so this friend set up a 24/7 accompaniment with him so that he would not kill himself. And so now I asked him, well, do you still want to commit suicide? And I'll never forget his answer. His answer was, my friends don't want me to. Because that's really important, right? I mean, to quote an ancient Jewish source, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world, right? We are all social animals and we need each other. And part of the reason why people commit suicide is because they don't think that anybody else cares about them. So one of the interventions that's really important if people are thinking of committing suicide is a lot of social support. And the lack of it is one reason when people think nobody cares, they might think of committing suicide. Another reason not to allow for assisted suicide is money. Money is a major contributing factor to all of this. Let's say I was talking about mom before. Dad is dying. He doesn't want to waste the family's money on what he considers to be futile care. So he wants to commit suicide in order to be able to have money to give to his heirs, right? Or your insurance company, or to put it the other way, let's say your children don't want dad to waste the family fortune because they want to inherit it, and so they want to help dad commit suicide. Or your insurance company, whether it be Medicare, in other words, a government form of insurance, or a private insurance company, would more than be happy to help you commit suicide because it's much cheaper to help you do that than to sustain you through long-term health care, right? So money is a major factor in making this whole decision much more difficult. And so in 1997, I said, for all of these reasons, we should not assist a suicide. But then two things happened. One was that starting in the late 1990s, that's when I wrote this, there were court cases asking whether there was a constitutional right to commit suicide and to get aid in committing suicide. One of those cases came before the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco, and they ruled that there is a constitutional right to not only commit suicide, but to assist a suicide based on the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment. Another appellate court, the Second Circuit in New York, ruled that there is a constitutional right to commit suicide and to have assistance in committing suicide based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In other words, if you could commit suicide on your own, but now you can't and you need assistance in doing that, you should be able to have it, because people who are not able to do it on their own should have the equal protection of the law to allow them to commit suicide as those who can do it on their own. And the fact of the matter is that suicide itself is not prohibited in any of the states of the Union or by federal law. They will try to, in California, for example, they will try to put you on a 72-hour hold, a psychiatric hold, to make sure that you are not psychotic in wanting to commit suicide. And they will try medications, they will try social interventions and all the like. But in the end, there's no law against committing suicide. You might say, well, what could they do to you once you commit suicide? Well, they can take away your property. They can shun your family. They can do all kinds of stuff. And they can put in prison the person who helped you commit suicide. So it's not as if the law could not could not assist that. And as a matter of fact, we do have the laws are among the states are all over the map as to what happens to a person who enables one to commit suicide, ranging from that person committed murder, aided and abetted a murder, to that person has no liability whatsoever, and it's all over the world, right? All over the map in terms of that. But in the Supreme Court then ruled 9-0 that this was not a federal matter decided by the Constitution. This was a state matter. And so starting in 1997-98, Oregon was the first state to allow assisted suicide. And now in 2020, when I wrote this new tshuva, 8 states and the District of Columbia allowed some kind of aid in dying. In California, it's called the End of Life Option Act. And Canada allows it. And Colombia in South America allows it. And the Netherlands and Belgium and Switzerland and Europe allow it, all with different kinds of limitations, but they all allow it. So that was one thing that changed. It now became civilly permitted, at least in some jurisdictions, to commit suicide, to have aid in suicide. Another thing that prompted me to write a revised version is that my daughter-in-law is an oncologist, and she told me that in the many years now, close to 20 years, at the time it was about 15 years when I was writing this tshuva, in the vast majority of cases, the doctors were able to quell pain. But she had sometimes at the cost of consciousness. In other words, the patient became unconscious as a result of the amount of morphine or whatever else was being used in order to quell pain. But she had witnessed 3 cases in which people screamed their way to death. So that was another thing that prompted me to write a new tshuva about this, which I called Assisted Suicide / Aid in Dying. And I'll tell you why the difference in terminology in a moment. And then I quoted underneath it the line from Psalm 145, which we say 3 times a day. God is good to all, and his mercies are over all his works. So in that tshuva, I said that theology here, that aspect of Jewish theology, should lead us to at least allow for aid in dying in those cases. I wanted to carve out a narrow exception from my 1997 ruling, that in those cases where the doctors cannot quell pain and the person is just screaming, that the person be allowed to have aid in dying under those circumstances. And I chose the California way of doing it as opposed to the Canadian way of doing it. California requires that you be able to do it on your own. You get aid from your doctors giving you the medications. You have to ask orally twice and then in writing with witnesses and all of that. And 2 doctors have to agree that it is medically appropriate that you get aid in dying at this time. But in the end, in California, you have to be able to apply the medications yourself. In Canada, you can get MAID, what's called medical aid in dying, where the doctor can do it. And both California and Canada passed this legislation in 2016, actually within 2 weeks of each other. And there has been many more such cases in Canada than in California. But nevertheless, it's a very small percentage of people who die in both of those jurisdictions who use aid in dying. I talk about aid in dying because I did a program for the Melton Center for Adult Learning, and in doing on these issues, and in doing so, I came across some people who said, a man in particular who said, I'm not committing suicide. I've tried to keep myself alive with all kinds of interventions. I just am in a lot of pain and I need to stop this pain. So it's really aid in dying or assisted dying rather than assisted suicide, because the people involved in this usually have tried as much as they can to keep themselves alive, but simply are not able to do it. So I wrote this tshuva. It's in the book, saying that in that very narrow band of cases, aid in dying should be allowed, Jewishly as well as in civil law, but only in those circumstances. Let me stop here and take whatever questions you have.
Yes, so we only have enough time for maybe one question, unfortunately. But there's a particularly interesting question here from Paul, and it says, hopefully we can answer this briefly. What is the relationship between pikuach nefesh and a definition of quality of life?
Uh, so pikuach nefesh means saving a life, and according to the Talmud, that takes precedence over all but three of the commandments. In other words, if in order to save somebody's life, you have to violate Shabbat, or you have to steal It's 3 a.m. You have to steal medications break into a pharmacy and steal medications. So whether it's ritual laws or moral laws, in the tradition, if you need to violate them in order to save somebody's life, you are required to violate them, not only permitted, but required to violate them in order to save that person's life. There are 3 exceptions to that. If somebody has a gun to your head and says, either murder that person or I will murder you, you have to prefer to die than to murder someone else. Another is to idolatry, to bow down to an idol, but there are all kinds of questions as to it has to be done publicly and it has to be done for the purpose of worship and all of that, all kinds of limitations on that. But murder, idolatry, and then the third exception is incest and adultery. Okay, but except for those exceptions, you must violate Jewish law if you need to, in order to save a person's life. And that's talking about the physical life of the person. But now the question is, well, especially given modern medical interventions, sometimes doctors can put in what they call the trach and a peg. That is a tracheotomy, which enables the person to breathe, and a peg that gives you artificial nutrition and hydration. And you can keep the person alive for a long time. Well, Terry Schiavo, 14 years. Okay, you can keep a person alive for a very long time physically, but with no consciousness whatsoever and no quality of life, however you understand that. So that's the reason why, and Jewish law doesn't really deal with that because, again, until very recently, that was just not an issue because there was no way to keep a person alive altogether. So there was never a question as to should you keep a person alive with this low quality of life or not, because you couldn't keep the person alive anyway. But now, in modern circumstances, we do have that question because, again, the person can be kept physically alive for a very long time with no consciousness whatsoever. That's the reason why it's really important that you fill out a durable power of attorney for healthcare, where you determine under what circumstances you would want to be kept alive and in what circumstances you would not want to be kept alive. So at least the persons who are making the decisions for you know what you would have wanted. And the conservative movement has one, the Orthodox world, the modern Orthodox world has one, and the Reform movement has. All 3 of them have an advanced directive based upon how each one of those movements understands how Jewish law and theology would apply to these end-of-life decisions.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Dorff. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today, but next week, next Wednesday, on November 13th is the final part of this 3-part series, and Rabbi Dorff will be speaking on speech, what to say, what not to say, and how to say it. And you can find the registration link in the chat, and thank you all so much for joining us.
And I asked you to read, those of you who have the book, I asked you to read chapters 12 to 14. Right,
Yes.
in the book, if you can, the Ethics at the Center, Jewish Theory and Practice for Living a Moral Life. If you can read chapters 12 to 14, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you go to register for the event, you'll see that link there as well to purchase that book. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Rabbi Dorff.
Thank you.